arguing from first principles recently got a little bit more street cred, as billionaire and entrepreneur Elon Musk, so the owner of Tesla and SpaceX and the Boring Company, mentioned that he does a lot of his problem solving by boiling it down to the most basic truths of the problem and trying to solve them from there. And initially that sounds counterintuitive, because if you really have to rethink everything in that chain of logic or events, it takes a lot more energy than the usual thinking process would take, and can make the process very strenuous and seemingly inefficient. But if you want to think differently and solve by different metrics, this is the only way you can do it. So let me give you an example of this. One of the most prolific lines in that mode of thinking was actually by Carl Sagan. And he has this famous line which goes, "If you wish to make an apple pie from scratch, you must first invent the universe." Now immediately we see our mind would go to, okay, we need flour, we need apples, we need sugar in order to bake a pie, right? No, Carl Sagan goes deeper and goes to the very, very first principles that we currently conceive of, which is the creation of the universe. Now, we don't need to go as deep in order to make it practical for Overwatch. So I will say that I will, for this example, use the first practical truths we know about Overwatch. So let me first apply maybe non-first principle thinking, which would be to say that Overwatch is a game with 27 heroes, and they fight it out, and in the end, whoever wins the most fights win, and therefore becoming good at fighting is the way you win in Overwatch. Well, technically that's true, and in practice that's often the case, but if we are arguing from first principles, we once again have to say, no, what are actually the win conditions? And the win conditions in Overwatch are very different, because we have 4 different map types, but in essence it boils down to you have to dominate space. It's not enough most of the time for these objectives to just be more on the point. You have to actually dominate that area, so to completely eradicate the opponent from the specific point. That is true for the payload, and that is also true for all the capture points in various maps. That's true for King of the Hill and whatever. So that is one specific aspect. So you need to dominate space. And the second part is that you need to dominate, or to do it in a specific time frame. So Overwatch is basically a game of space and time. And we will see that also time works very differently, and that space is more or less important in different situations. So, for instance, one of the most apparent situations when we know that winning fight, it's not all about winning fights, is if someone backcaps a point. Backcapping is while a fight is going on, someone slips through to the objective and, for instance, tags it or pushes the payload in, right? And that doesn't happen too often, mainly for the reasons that a fight first needs to be won because of the dominant aspect of space inhabitants. So, how does it all... Why is it a good idea to then think about first principles if, in general, yes, people very clearly understand that it's sort of easy to stand on the point, and even though you often hear that people don't really, get to the payload or get to the point. Well, I think one specific example that I've recently discovered is very interesting, and that was also backed up by data, which I might present down the line, we'll see. But when I looked at the data for Lunatic High, it seemed like they needed to win less fights, and fights on Winston's Lab are defined as if a kill happens, a 15-second timer ticks up so as to see if another kill happens, then the the duration is once again extended 15 seconds. And only after 15 seconds, when nothing happens, a fight is over, right? So we can pretty much see that either the team was wiped or the team retreated successfully, most of the time. Obviously, there are situations where fight is still going on, where damage is still exchanged, but we sadly don't have API access to sort of maybe, judge it by damage exchange, even on shields, or even opponents being in line of sight of each other. That could also be a definition of fight. So let's just go off of that definition of fight, that a kill needed to have happened in the last 15 seconds. I think you can still draw a lot of conclusions from this. And Lunatic High did not only need to win less fights on offense in order to achieve their goals, they also won less fights than their opponent in comparison. And I remember a specific situation in Apex Season 3, I think it was, where they were through the, I believe, quarterfinals, and they were still in the negative win percentage of fights. Now, that could obviously be with our definition of fights, but over such a large sample size of games, it's very likely that Lunatic High just knows that we can't think of fights as very strict. Okay, we go in and then we kill the others and it's all like click, clack, bang, half a minute, it's all over. But that Lunatic High approaches the principle of a fight very differently. And I believe that is best explored by arguing from first principles. So I believe what they must have done is like to say, okay, yes, we still have to win fights to gain points, but how do we make the most out of winning these fights? And what you will see is that obviously, despite their pretty well executed ultimate advantage, Lunatic High also really employs the strategy of staggering opponents very well. And what they also do on defense is that they redistribute ultimate charge much more than other teams, even though it's still not, where it should be. But also on offense, they tend to grab more space when they win a fight. And that was also very true for, let's say, Rogue, for instance. So we knew, we heard Win say that that he was on the payload and that the others were off somewhere and they would just push from behind. Well, what they didn't do was just run to the spawn, and we will get to this later, but what they did was they basically looked at where the best positions on a map were. So for instance, if we're thinking about Hollywood, where it most prolifically happened, was they won a fight in the choke, and then they would place wins on the card and take high ground advantages in order to get into the fight the next time, while keeping wins on the payload, and then for either him to keep pushing the payload while the next fight emerges and them not immediately losing it because of a numbers disadvantage, but because of better positioning to sort of get more out of a one fight than they would usually have, and then also to strengthen the possibility of winning the next fight, which is already the case because you also have most of the time have an ultimate advantage if you want to fight on at that point, right? So because you already won the cap on point A, so you should, at this point, you probably should have an ultimate advantage. So let me take a sip of coffee here. Yes. So the most interesting variation of taking fights and really seeing that they don't have to conceptualize the meaning of a fight in their minds, and that they really thought about what Overwatch was or is as a game, what the win conditions are, were obviously Selfless. And yes, that might be true because of their personalities, that they want to be always in front of the spawn door and really get into the opponent and really beat them as hard as possible, right? To rip out their hearts and like see it beating in front of them, right? This type of mentality, but it also fed into the strategy that revolved. And I remember an interview with Selfless Brad at the time, now obviously the head coach of the San Francisco Shock, where he said, there's actually a reason we're doing this, because if you stand in front of the opponent's spawn, that means you've now gathered a lot more space from what they should normally given up to them, just by nature of map layout or whatever. And if you can actually hold them there, it's not that bad that when you lose that control, because then you spawn in, and realistically they only lost a little bit, which they have to reconquer, possibly not even with all of their people, and that was most probably done again on Hollywood, because it takes time to get to the high ground for some of these characters. So even if your spawn camp fails and the opponent did actually take the position back, they now need to move back into the favorable positions, and that will take time, and you will have the opportunity to get into position sooner than you would normally do. And maybe you can, the distance between, for instance, point A on Hollywood and point B would therefore have to be 5 fights won in a row instead of 4. I will look at the data again, how much fights you win. I would think you would probably need 3 if I go through it in my mind. But obviously that's not based on any credible data sources. So I would think it takes 3 more fights to win, unless obviously your payload moves back by a lot, than the defending opponent in order to cap B. So another thing is that Lunatic High did very well was they realized the importance of first kills, and when they conceded first kill, once again on Hollywood for instance, what they would do is move into a strategically advantageous position, and for instance on Hollywood they would leave the point and go back, and depending on the member they lost, if they knew, okay, this guy is a fast guy, this is a Lucio, he can get back to our fight, they would stagger it so long as to allow them to fight 6v6 again, and they would just shut it sealed at under the balcony, and just they all be in that room, and they'd have a Reinhardt, and then they move out again. Now, what is also very important is to realize how these win conditions work with capture points, because ever since we had the inclusion of the 3 blip system for capture points, the first 30% aren't at all that important, because they completely snap back to 0% and also don't give you anything towards your win condition. So to be on point at 0% channeling actually doesn't make that much sense for defense if they don't necessarily need to, or if it's not favorable to them. So Lunatic High very quickly realized that they don't actually need to have someone on the point if it means they would lose that fight, but maybe they could just have it tick up to 20%. Maybe the guy came back then, and then they could make it a full fight. And if not, they had an extremely well done way to drag out disadvantageous fights where they are 1 down or 2 down, where they still survive for such a long time and really perfected. It's not necessarily staggering at this point, I guess. We would have to find another word for that. But to really get the most time out of the opponent while they try to clear you up and make it as hard for them as possible to take that point in order to, again, win time windows. So that's, again, if we remember WEC, the first principles, space and time, right? So what does that mean for the future of Overwatch? Well, again, yes, there might be situations where you don't necessarily need to win fights, but you just need to boop people off the specific dominant era, and that's already happens in stagger situations where they don't necessarily kill that last guy before the entire points channels, but they just keep him off. For instance, a Reinhardt would charge a Roadhog and he wouldn't die, but he doesn't get on point, and therefore you cap. Maybe that can be extended. Maybe you can get more people off the point at any given point, and maybe you can exploit the greediness of defenses when they try to employ these strategies, as Lunatic High do, when they are one down. Maybe that you can keep them off. Maybe you can then tick over 30%. Certainly, another way, the principle of winning from first, or arguing from first principles, is to redefine what fights actually are, and to really sort of decide. There was once a debate, for instance, for very safe attacks. So you would probably take something like Zarya and Hanzo, and you would push into the opponent, and you would gather up ult charge, and at some point you have this big combo of Graviton and the Dragon Strike, and you would just win fights and win them safely. And I think teams could develop a profile for themselves where they are very good on defense on specific maps, and they know they will hold the opponent for a very long time, or will actually full hold the opponent with a certainty, let's say 30%, then it's not impossible that maybe teams wouldn't prioritize time, but would prioritize space more, in the sense that they would take their sweet time. They know they can finish the map in maybe only overtime every time at 3 points, but they know they have a very, very good defense and can chip away blocks of time every time a fight breaks out. They can strain the concept of a fight, especially how we have defined it at Winston's Lab. And then when a situation arises, maybe they would pick a Mei, which is very good at getting people out of that specific space, otherwise they die, but they need to be on in order to keep these overtime tickers from expiring. So if that all was to happen, maybe we could see a smarter approach to Overwatch, a more refined approach, other than most of the time it looking like, you know, taking fights. And I don't even want to necessarily ascribe that to pro teams, but that is more tinkered towards solo queue, maybe higher level solo queue, where we then have another understanding of a fight and what it actually means to win fights, and what advantages you get outside of direct gameplay mechanics such as ultimate advantage, right? So if we're arguing from first principles, I think it's much easier to see how malleable the concept of a fight is, and how you could chip away space and time with these fights, and how you could maybe even win without winning a fight. Thanks for listening.